English, then listening to as much audio content as you possibly can is one of the best ways to do so, especially if you're at like an intermediate or advanced level and you feel a little bit stuck or plateaued and you don't know what you can continue to do to continue improving your English. This is definitely the way to do it. But you need to stop listening to boring content. I mean, that kind of news in slow English, or like how to order a coffee in English, and this kind of stuff, especially this kind of language-focused content in which the person who's speaking is modifying their voice to be more easily understood by you. That is, they are over-enunciating and they're speaking slower than they normally would. And in this kind of content, they're often talking about things that I find to be kind of repetitive, or like this kind of content that I've already thought about before. And so therefore, to me, it is frankly a little bit boring. And that's the kind of content I think doesn't really serve you once you're past the beginner level of learning a language. So in today's episode of the Fluency Habit podcast, I want to talk about what kind of content I do think you should be spending your time listening to that will make the process actually fun, interesting, entertaining, and enjoyable, which to me is kind of the key of making sure that it actually works. My name is Meredith. I am the creator of phoneticfluency.com, where my goal, my mission, is to help you fill the gap in your English that you need to finally become fluent. And for so many people out there, that is phonetics and pronunciation. You can go to phoneticfluency.com to learn more, or you can click the link in the description of this video to download my free pronunciation guide to kind of see what kind of things I teach. So again, in today's episode, that's our topic, is how to make listening practice fun, because this is my opinion, but I also think there are studies that back this. When you're learning another language, receiving as much of the auditory language to absorb it into your brain is one of the most important parts of it. Because the language doesn't come from inside you. You don't have, like, if you're not a native English speaker, you don't have English like resting dormant inside you that's gonna awaken when you speak a lot. And same for any other language. The language comes from outside of you and you need to absorb it in order to have it in your brain and then be able to output it yourself. So the more listening practice you can do, the better. But you need to do the right listening practice so that you're not bored and so that you stick with it. So this kind of boring, repetitive content is bad for two main reasons. When the presenter or the teacher or the content creator or whatever is speaking artificially slow, or over-enunciating in a way that they wouldn't normally do. This might work if you're a beginner, but if you're beyond the beginner stage, this is actually kind of training your ears and your brain to understand a non-real version of English, a version of English that is more closely connected to how English is written and is spoken in a way that people, frankly, don't really speak in real life. So this is kind of setting you up for bad listening habits. In my content, I don't modify my speech at all. I speak exactly the same way that I would to any other native speaker of English. And that is intentional, because if you're listening to me and you understand, 80% of what I say, then I think just through listening to me over time, your ear is going to adapt to how I say things and the kind of contractions and reductions that I make. And eventually you're going to increase from 80% up to 90, 95, or maybe even 100%, understanding 100% of what I say. If that's not the case and you are like maybe lower than 80% and you hear me and there are ways that I reduce or contract words that you don't understand at all, then you can turn on the captions and kind of analyze it, because this kind of understanding of English, how it's actually spoken in real life, basically tuning your ear to that sound is going to be very important for you, because in real life, people aren't going to modify their speech for you. Usually not, especially if you're in like a group setting with tons of native speakers, and if you're maybe the only non-native speaker, then you've got to catch up. You've got to be able to hear the way that native speakers hear. And the only way to do that is the same way that native speakers learn in any language, which is by constantly being exposed to the real language and just having this ear-brain connection catch up to how the real language is actually spoken. I went off a little bit on a tangent there, but basically, when you listen to content where people are speaking artificially slow or artificially over-enunciated, this is setting you up for kind of bad listening habits. The other part of this content more about the content side of it, like what is actually being talked about, I find that a lot of that content tends to circle around the same topics over and over. These kind of topics that always feel somehow connected to language learning, somehow connected to like day-to-day stuff. And I don't know, I just kind of get bored of like day-to-day stuff type content. So I think that when you listen to this kind of content, which is boring, your brain gets bored, and so it shuts off. And so whatever audio that you're listening to, it just becomes background noise, and it's not actually giving you the benefit that it should be giving you. Now, I just want to say this is a matter of taste. So even if these kind of topics feel a little bit boring to me, they might not be for you. I mentioned at the very top of the video, like news in slow English. When I was learning Spanish, and now that I'm learning Portuguese, well, I mean, now that I'm learning Portuguese, I don't do it because I've learned from my past experience. But when I started learning Spanish, of course, one of the most popular tools or resources that people recommend is that kind of content, like news in slow Spanish. And I tried, and I was like, God, this is so boring. And the thing that clicked for me is like, I don't even listen to the news in English. If I don't listen to news in my native language, then why would I listen to it in a separate language? Nowadays, I do listen to the news sometimes, but anyways, that's besides the point. My point is, we need to make a new rule, which is, if you wouldn't listen to it in your native language, then you shouldn't listen to it in your target language either. I firmly believe, this is one of my core beliefs about language learning, that it has to be enjoyable and fun, or it probably won't work. If it's like pulling teeth, by the way, this is a common English expression, something is like pulling teeth if it's like something you have to fight yourself to do or fight someone else to do. Like if you are trying to, let's say you have a kid and you're trying to get them out the door and in the car, you could say that that's like pulling teeth because they're resisting you every step of the way. So if learning a language, if doing the steps that you need to do, like your homework and listening practice, if that's like pulling teeth, then it's my belief that you're always going to be relatively limited in how far you can go with that language. So it has to be fun, it has to be interesting, and it has to be enjoyable for it to actually work. If we keep my philosophy in mind, then it's pretty clear that listening to content that is boring or does not interest us at all is not really going to have a good effect on our language learning outcomes. Pragmatically speaking, if you think about it, listening to content that you enjoy naturally is going to make the learning process a lot faster and more efficient. Because whatever you're listening to, if you are genuinely interested in it and enjoy it, then you want to know what's going to happen. Like imagining it's a story, it's like, what's going to happen next? Or if it's a podcast, like, what are they going to say next? So because of that, your brain is going to start looking for context clues and kind of filling in the gaps of the things that you don't know, which is going to make you learn faster. As I said, when we learn our first language as children, this is basically how we learn it. There's a lot of other stuff involved, but essentially we're absorbing a lot of the language and making connections in a natural way rather than in like a studious way of like, okay, this means this and this means this. But we absorb the language and our brain kind of does the work for us of making connections. And so if you are listening to content that you find fun, entertaining, enjoyable, interesting, or whatever, then your brain's going to start doing that on its own because you care about the content. And so this subconscious language learning process that's going on in the background is going to happen faster and more efficiently, which is going to bring you to your ultimate goal a lot faster, and you're going to have fun while you do it. Because the thing about learning a language is it's not fast. I know a lot of people build businesses around this idea of like fluent in however many weeks or however many months, because in language learning, I have noticed there's a strong focus and concentration on like, how many hours do I need? How many weeks, how many months, how many years until I become fluent? So the strong concentration is on the end result of fluency. And this can be damaging because you're going to lose interest or you're going to become demotivated because it is a long process. Like I am to this day, after 6 years, still learning Spanish. So you kind of have to let that go. And that's another part of the reason I have this philosophy that the task of language learning, the things you do as part of language learning have to be fun and enjoyable, because you have to maintain motivation over a very long period of time, like years, because the final result is going to be years away. Or maybe you never really get there, because I think we're all still improving in our native languages. So language learning is a lifelong thing. So you need to be okay with that, and having fun as you do it is kind of a necessary part of that equation. When you listen to this content that's designed for learning, I think a lot of times people listen to it and are like, okay, I want to get to the point where I understand 100% of what I hear. Let's replace that goal with, I want to be so entertained or engaged in the content that I'm listening to that I actually forget that it's in English. Now that I've explained to you why it's important that you do consume a lot of audio content, a lot of comprehensible input in English or whatever target language, but also that it's super important that you actually enjoy this content that you're listening to in order for it to have the desired learning outcomes. This episode wouldn't be complete if I didn't give you some of my recommendations for things that you can listen to in English. So if you're an English learner or trying to improve your English, or even if not, these are some really good suggestions. These are based on my interests. These are the things that I like and enjoy. So if you don't like and enjoy them, then you have bad taste. Just kidding. But no, obviously it's something that's subjective. So the things that I like and enjoy, maybe you will or maybe you won't also like and enjoy them, but they're pretty good, so you probably will. I'm going to divide this into categories, and the first category is going to be podcasts, and the second category is YouTube channels or videos. And then after that, I'm going to tell you about the secret third thing that I think that a lot of people do not know about. People are sleeping on. This is a very common slang phrase recently. To be sleeping on something is something is there, but people aren't giving it the attention that it merits. So people are sleeping on this third option. We'll start with the first category, which is podcasts. And I think podcasts are just one of the most excellent ways to really create a virtual auditory immersion in English. So this is a way that you're constantly listening and constantly absorbing the melody and cadence and words and phrases and all these things that you need to absorb in order to improve your English. I personally listen to a ton of podcasts. I don't know, something about it just works very well and does something very positive for my ADHD brain. So if I'm doing activities that don't require me to hear the people or things around me and don't require me to speak, then I probably have headphones in or earbuds in and am listening to a podcast. So I have a lot of podcast recommendations. I'm going to limit it here to 3 podcasts. And these are top tier, very well-produced podcasts that have also a very large backlog of past episodes for you to go in and dive into and listen to. I tend to listen to podcasts mostly in English, and I think that's mainly because I think that the podcast medium has had the longest amount of time to marinate and really pop out some very good content in English specifically, more so than other languages until now. I've kind of tried to find podcasts in Spanish, and I found some that are good, but I've never found a podcast that really just gripped me the way these recommendations that I'm going to give you have in Spanish so far. So if you have recommendations for very excellent podcasts in Spanish that you think could be at the level of the ones I'm going to recommend, please leave them in the comments. What I'm kind of looking for is, I don't really love podcasts where it's completely unscripted and there's not a kind of flow to it. I don't like these kind of podcasts where it's just a couple guys around a microphone just kind of saying whatever comes to their mind. I like podcasts that have a specific topic that's being explored, and it's kind of they guide you through the topic in phases, and especially if they involve other people or have sound design or these kind of things. So well-produced podcasts that cover certain topics, even if those topics are very varied, it doesn't matter. That's the kind of thing I like, and those are the kinds of things I'm going to recommend to you. So if you have any recommendations like that in Spanish or in Portuguese, leave them in the comments. In Portuguese, my level probably isn't at that point where I could realistically understand enough of the content for it to be useful for me, but maybe sometime in the near future. So you can leave those kind of recommendations in the comments for me. Now, let's go ahead and get on to my recommendations. The first one I will recommend, for me, top podcast in English is Radiolab. Radiolab is an amazing podcast, and it's very difficult to say what Radiolab is about. We could say Radiolab is kind of about science, but I think that's putting it in too small of a box, because Radiolab can really be about anything. It's a show where the topic changes episode to episode. So in each episode, which is quite long, which I enjoy, they will dive very deeply into one particular question. And that question can be about science a lot of the time, but also about things like philosophy or legal cases or basically anything like history or even linguistics. There have been a couple episodes that are sort of linguistically related, and one of those I will mention later when I tell you what episodes are my favorites, so you know what episodes you can start with. why I think this podcast is good generally, but also specifically good for people maybe like yourself who are English learners and are trying to listen to a lot of audio content in order to level up their English. One thing I really like about it is that even though it is a very famous podcast, it is very well produced, high production value, it's also very deep and all this stuff, the people, the hosts that is, they still talk like normal people. What I mean by that is like they don't have this kind of specific radio broadcaster voice. And I think this is really good for me as a listener because I think that kind of artificial radio voice can be very tiring to listen to. But if you're a learner of English, I personally would rather you be exposed to real English, like the kind of English that people are going to speak to you at work or in your friend groups or any kind of like natural, non-artificial situation. So I love that they use real voices. They don't over-enunciate. They don't speak extra slow. They use filler words and they don't cut them out. They don't cut it out if they stutter or need a moment to think or compose themselves and think about what they're going to say, just like I'm kind of doing in this podcast. Another thing that I think is very cool and also is one of the reasons that this podcast is quite famous is their amazing sound design. So if I recall correctly, I think the origin story is that the creator of the podcast, Jad Abumrad, came from an audio engineering background. And so when he created Radiolab, he was like, okay, how can I make a podcast that involves these like complex audio editing features? So for example, imagine that the two hosts are talking about what the topic is going to be. And the other thing, kind of a digression, but it just feels like you're in one scene and then that scene will end and it will cut to another scene. Just like in a movie, you're in one place and then there's a cut and then now you're in another place, which is a different scene of the movie. And they managed to achieve this in an audio, like sonic way through changes in sound and music and tone and voices. And I think this is so interesting. It keeps me super, super engaged. It feels almost like watching a movie, but in an audio way. So going back to like the sound design, that's something that they do through the medium of sound design. So imagine the two hosts are talking and they're talking about like, I don't know, some special fish or like bacteria. And they're like, okay, and to learn more about this, we're going to first travel to the such and such river. And then in the background, you'll start hearing like the sound of a babbling river in the background. And then that's going to lead you kind of into the next segment or the next, like, I think of them like scenes. Another thing is it's learning in a way that never falls into this feeling like a boring, dry lecture. So these are two people who are quite intelligent and know a lot about science and a lot of the topics that they cover, but everything that's explained guides you into what could end up being a very, very complex topic in a way that never begins to feel overwhelming and never ends up feeling like a boring lecture. So I'm really into learning all the time, and so I like learning about things that maybe otherwise I wouldn't have taken the time to investigate on my own. And they do this in a way that feels so natural. Like, imagine people explaining to you as if you were like a reasonably intelligent high school student, but one who didn't have previous background knowledge of whatever the topic is. So it feels very lighthearted and easy to listen to, while at the same time covering very complex and in-depth topics. My favorite episodes of Radiolab, at least off the top of my head that I can remember after years of listening to this podcast, Eye in the Sky, Hello, and The Whoopi Effect. So if you're looking for a starting point to dip your toes in the water, this is an English expression to say like to kind of test something to see if it works for you or if you like it, the way you would dip your toe in the water to see if the temperature is good so that you can get in the water. If you want to dip your toe in the water with Radiolab, these are the episodes you can start with, because I think they're some of the most fun and interesting ones, and see if you like them. And then from there, you can listen to all of them because there are, like, by this point, probably hundreds of back episodes that you can listen to. That's Radiolab. And the next podcast I want to recommend is quite different. It's called If Books Could Kill. And it's got a different vibe because it doesn't have all of the high production audio engineering kind of stuff that Radiolab has. And I mentioned earlier that I don't love that genre of podcast where it's just like a couple guys around a microphone riffing. Riffing is a term in English that means like kind of like improvising, but with your words. So whatever the person you're talking with just said to you, you kind of like think of a clever, witty, humorous reply, and you kind of go back and forth with each other based on what the other is saying. That's what riffing means. So I said that I don't really love that genre of podcast where it's just a couple guys around a microphone riffing. And that's kind of what this podcast is, but it's different because they deep dive into one topic and there is a certain layout, there is a flow, like what's the word I'm looking for? Like an outline of what they're gonna cover throughout the episode. So they cover books, but in a critical lens, through a critical lens. So basically what this podcast is about is it's two guys tearing apart best-selling nonfiction, quote-unquote, airport books. Their definition of airport books are like books, for example, like Outliers or Rich Dad, Poor Dad. These kind of books that you will find in any kind of airport bookstore that are usually sort of self-help adjacent. And when I say that they tear these apart, they kind of basically say, okay, these books tend to make some pretty bold, extreme claims. So let's see if that actually holds up under scrutiny, and let's see where their sources actually come from, and let's see, you should just listen to it and get an idea. But why I think this podcast is good, why I personally enjoy it even as a native speaker, and why I think it would be good if you're a non-native speaker who is trying to improve your listening comprehension and improve your English in general, is because these guys are so funny. Like, I could basically listen to them talk about anything because the two hosts have hilarious, amazing chemistry, like the way they riff off of each other. And some of the episodes that I've listened to, because at this point I've listened to all of the free episodes, some of the stuff that I have listened to are books that I have not read and about topics that frankly I don't know very much about at all. And frankly, I'm not that interested in, but even still, I will listen to it because these guys are just so funny and also very smart that I like listening to them talk about essentially anything. I think this is a kind of a unique combination, which is very complex social or societal topics, but being covered and spoken about in a way that's really funny and fresh and uses slang and like filler words and sarcasm and humor. So I think it is excellent for those reasons. So I just think it's really funny. That's the main reason I listen to it. And I tend to agree with the points of views of the host. I mean, not always, but I think in general they're relatively fair. They tear apart these books, and a lot of the times when you listen to them, you will realize like, whoa, I never would have thought it was that deep. Because these books sometimes seem kind of harmless. And then as you listen to them, like I said, these are two really smart guys, you'll be like, oh, maybe it's not as harmless as I thought. So it's interesting and hilarious. My favorite episodes, just off the top of my head, the ones that I can recall having listened to and thinking that they were funny or interesting were Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. I was laughing my ass off during that episode, so that one's really, really funny. And a classic episode from them, because it's a classic, famous, like, self-help type book, which I will admit I have read maybe, 10 years ago, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That's a good episode as well. But honestly, you can listen to basically any episode. Moving on to my final podcast suggestion is a podcast that has been canceled or discontinued, but not before, fortunately for us, having made tons and tons of episodes. So there are like, I don't know how many, like let's say 200 back episodes you can go back and listen to. And that podcast is Reply All. Again, this is a podcast that's a little bit difficult to describe. I think their self-branding was a podcast about the internet. But that is kind of a misleading catchphrase or slogan because, in fact, if you hear that, a podcast about the internet, it kind of makes it sound like perhaps it would be like techie. And I guess somehow it is techie, but I don't consider myself a particularly techie person, but I am able to enjoy the stories that they tell because that's how I would describe it. It's more of like a podcast that dives deeply into very interesting and also very human stories that you somehow feel like, reveal something about humanity, which sounds very deep, and it's a funny podcast, but at times it can be very deep. So why it's a good podcast in general and why I think it's good for non-native speakers improving their English, I think maybe you have caught on to a theme of my personal tastes, which is I really like when there manages to be a balance between funny and entertaining and very deep and intellectual, which this podcast manages to do. So once again, it's super interesting, it's super engaging, it's super fun, so it doesn't feel like homework or doesn't feel like a lecture when you listen to it, so it's just gonna feel like something you do for entertainment. And once again, just like in my other recommendations, again, this is a recurring theme because it is super important, they speak completely authentically. It's a 100% authentic dialogue. It's unscripted, so you're gonna hear a full use of modern slang, laughter, natural interruptions, filler words, and these guys have good chemistry as well, so it's basically gonna be like you eavesdropping on what it sounds like for two close friends to be like chatting about sometimes deep topics in a natural, casual way as two native speakers would do. My favorite episodes are The Snapchat Thief and Long Distance, parts 1 and 2. You can start with any episode, and honestly, this podcast is so good that you could start with episode 1 and listen to that and then just work your way through the entire catalog, but I also feel that way about all of the podcasts that I have recommended. So let's move on to the next category, which is YouTube. Obviously, YouTube is a video-based platform, but if I'm watching something that the visual element is necessary, then I'll obviously watch the video, but I spend a lot of time just listening to YouTube videos. When it comes to YouTube videos, unlike the podcast recommendations, which were very general, that is, no matter what your personal interests are, these podcasts are varied enough that I think you will find something that you enjoy about them. The YouTube videos that I tend to watch are going to be more specific to my own unique interests and whatever I'm into at the moment. So my suggestion for finding YouTube content that you like is just look at what kind of content do I vibe with and listen to and enjoy in my native language, and then try to find similar content in English or whatever your target language is. For example, when I was learning Spanish, I watched a lot of videos by Luisito Comunica, who is, I think, the most famous Mexican YouTuber. And the reason this worked very well for me is because he makes content that's not geared towards learners. So what that means is he can talk about anything. So I'm getting exposed to, I guess, mostly travel content, but a wide variety of expressions and vocabulary and context, so that therefore I don't get bored by hearing the same kind of learning-oriented content over and over. And also that means he's not modifying his speech to make it more clear for non-native speakers. However, him in particular, I do think he has a very clear and enunciated way of talking naturally. So even though he's not modifying his speech, it's still like real Spanish, let's say, I still find him very clear and easy to understand, which helped me a lot as a learner. The other part is that because he's Mexican, obviously a lot of the slang that he uses and cultural references and these kind of things would work for someone like me who was learning specifically Mexican Spanish and who was later going to end up living in Mexico. So that's just an example. For English, what I listen to or watch varies a lot depending on what is kind of like the thing I'm most into at the moment. So for example, recently I'm kind of getting into calisthenics, so a lot of that kind of content comes up on my feed and I might watch or interact with that content. Additionally, like I kind of like personal finance and productivity type stuff personally, so when those kind of channels come up, I tend to watch those kind of videos. So anyways, the suggestions I make right now might not even be the same thing that I'm watching a year from now or that I was watching a year ago. But for example, I recently am really into the channel I Will Teach You to Be Rich, which is basically like a personal finance podcast slash YouTube channel. Ramit Sethi is the host, and I really vibe with him. Like all the perspectives that he tends to have about life and travel and personal finance, because all of it comes together in the channel, I really vibe with it. So I enjoy his channel a lot recently. Another example of something that I listen to that has nothing to do with the former is I listen to two main kind of podcasts slash channels that are about like Reddit stories, which are Opie Said and Smosh Reads Reddit Stories. And this is purely entertainment. When I have like nothing in particular I want to listen to, or kind of like, I just want something kind of almost like background noise, this is the kind of content I will go for, because it doesn't require me to be constantly learning, because I do think you can oversaturate your brain with too much learning if you're constantly listening to like very deep stuff like Radiolab. This is kind of my reality TV equivalent in podcast form. So Opie Said is a trio of three British girls who are super funny, and I really like the contrast between when I listen to their content and when I listen to Smosh Reads Reddit Stories, because Smosh Reads Reddit Stories, I am not familiar with like their other content necessarily. I know obviously they have this channel, but they're like professional actors and comedians, so the style, the way that they can make jokes with each other is a little bit more like like something you would expect from a professional comedian, right? Or a group of professional comedians. But at the same time, they tend to be extremely nuanced on points. They say, well, this, but that, and this, but that. Whereas on the other hand, the girls from OP Said are not professional comedians, but they are very, very naturally funny, but they are pretty, like, firm. When they read a story, they're like, this is wrong and here's why, and you're dumb because you should have done this. And I think that's so funny. So I like the balance of these two. And again, this is just my kind of like content that I listen to when I'm just bored and want something to listen to. And the final thing I recommend, I don't think I've seen that many of his videos, but this guy is really, really famous, Matt D'Avella. And he makes videos basically about, I don't know, like productivity, lifestyle, fitness, and those are topics that recently I'm kind of into. So I give these recommendations in order to give you something, but it's really gonna depend on what you're into. So go out and explore and find whatever content vibes with you in English, the same way that it vibes with you in your native language, and that's what's gonna work best for you for comprehensible input listening practice. Now it's time for the final secret third category I mentioned at the beginning. And obviously it's not a real secret, but it just feels like a secret because when I talk to people, whether they're from the US or not, whether they're a native speaker or not, when I talk to people about this, most people don't know about it previously. And what I'm talking about is the Libby app connected to your library, and specifically the Great Courses, which is a collection of audiobook courses, which is available for free through this app. We're gonna talk about all of it. So growing up in the US, for me, it was really, really normal to go to the library. I've had a library card for my entire life. And when I moved to Mexico, there's a little bit of a cultural difference there. Like there are libraries here in Mexico City, like for example, La Biblioteca Vasconcelos, and I've been there and you can get a card and you can check out books. But it's not the same, there's not a library in every kind of district of the city that you can go to, the same way that there is in the US. But anyways, so I am still using my US library card, or I was still using my US library card for this app until it expired. And then I had to get a new library card from a different area, and I will talk about that in just a second. Essentially what this is the Libby app is an app that you can get for free on Android or iPhone. And once you get this app, the first thing it's going to ask you for is your library card information. So you need to have a library card, which is totally possible to do even if you don't live in one of these countries. But according to this Google search I just did, if you live in one of these countries, you can go to your nearest local library, get a library card, and then be able to connect it to Libby. That is the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, Finland, Thailand, Switzerland, and Malaysia. I don't know entirely how accurate this list is, but I know in my experience, like if you're from the US, whatever library you go to that's near you, and if you get a library card there, almost certainly you will be able to connect it to Libby without any problem. So imagining you live in one of these countries and you go get the library card, so you're just gonna go on Google Maps, type in library near me, and then go to that library with, like some kind of proof of address and your identification, and then you'll get a library card. So now that you have the physical library card with a number and probably a PIN number that they will send you via email, on the Libby app you will add this information, and that's how you kind of log in. And now you have access to your local library's entire digital collection. If you do not live in one of these countries and therefore can't go into a local branch and get a library card that works with Libby, like in my case, once my library card expired, I wasn't going back to the US anytime soon, so I had to find another option because I use this app like crazy. So what I did is I Googled like libraries in the US that will allow me to get a card, like a digital card, even if I don't live in the region. And so I found a library that allowed that, and instead of it being free, because if you go to your public local library and you actually live in that region, it's gonna be free, which is incredible, right? But I did have to pay a fee. It was like $50 a year or something like that, which to me, absolutely worth it. So once you have your physical library card or digital library card, whatever the case may be, you log in to the Libby app, and then you have access to this entire digital catalog of books, ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, all kinds of stuff. And in fact, I probably haven't even explored half of what is available through Libby. But the one I want to talk about today, the one that I super love, that I discovered somehow years ago on Libby by accident, is a series called The Great Courses. What the Great Courses are, and again, when I talk to people, like people do not know about this, and I'm like, bro, this is like revolutionary, and no one knows about it. But The Great Courses, I think the parent company is called The Teaching Company, but it's a company, a branch of a company, where they make audio courses in collaboration with world famous professors in different areas of knowledge. So it's like any area of knowledge you can think of, they probably have a course on. They take these professors and they design together a course that will bring you through whatever the topic is. And it's like a recorded lecture. In this case, the, let's say, downside is that unlike all the other resources I've mentioned until now, you're not going to hear quote unquote real speech, because these are university professors and they're doing an audio course. So they do have a little bit more of that like radio voice where they're talking perhaps in a more formal way than they normally would and maybe not using as many contractions, but it doesn't matter because these courses are so freaking good and there are so many of them and they're so interesting. And like, as you can tell by probably this whole video, I'm really into like knowledge and learning and kind of like always expanding my mind. So these courses are super, super awesome. So what you need to do is get your library card, get the Libby app, sign up, and then you have access to all this stuff. And not every library has access to the great courses, but I think a lot of them do. So I'm going to tell you the names of my favorite great courses that I have listened to since I discovered them, which are Ancient Civilizations of North America, The Story of Human Language, which is by Professor John McWhorter, who is a linguistics professor and a linguist. He has multiple courses with the great courses, so basically anything by John McWhorter with the great courses is going to be good, but a really good starting point, and the one that I enjoyed the most by him that I have heard so far, was The Story of Human Language. And then finally, the most recent one that I've listened to that really knocked my socks off was Death, Dying, and the Afterlife. 10 out of 10. Amazing course. Very interesting. Sensitive if you are dealing with grief recently, but if you feel like prepared for a topic like that, because it is heavy, it's really life-changing. I didn't add this to my notes or to my list, but because the Odyssey movie just came out and I saw it yesterday, it reminded me that there are also two courses. There's one about the Odyssey and there's one about the Iliad, and those are both excellent as well. So those are all of my recommendations. These are good recommendations, obviously, if you're a native speaker like me, because I just think they're really entertaining and fun and interesting to listen to. But I also think they would function very, very well for this specific purpose, which is if you're a non-native speaker who's kind of at an intermediate or advanced level and like you're no longer benefiting from this kind of boring teaching type content and you're ready to level up your English, then this content is definitely going to do it for you. Like I said, it is a subjective thing, so these are the things that I think are good, but the part that I don't think is quite as subjective is the fact that you need to be listening to audio content. You need to be creating like a virtual immersion of English or whatever your target language is and absorbing as much of that language as you possibly can so that you are picking up subconsciously even on slang, on idioms, on filler words that we use, turns of phrase, like the rhythm and cadence and melody of the language. So to do all of those things subconsciously, you need to be absorbing as much of the language that you can through audio content. So these are my suggestions. What you can do with this can be defined as passive learning or active learning, or passive listening and active listening. So in passive listening, pretty self-explanatory. You would just listen while you're doing other things or whatever. And the point of this is, again, the absorption. Like obviously you're paying attention and you're listening to it, but maybe not like in this focused way that you might do in active listening. So for active listening, what would be different, the only thing I would say would be different is in active listening, you might be actually taking the time to shadow what you hear, like speak along with the speaker or the narrator, trying to mimic their cadence and melody. Or every time you hear like a idiom or phrase that you're not familiar with, you take the time to add that to your Anki spreadsheet so that you can study it in your Anki set later, which I have covered obviously in my Anki setup tutorial video, which you can find on my channel. That's it from me for today. If you're ready to start listening to content for native speakers that's gonna have actual English as the way that you will hear it in real life, but you're a little bit nervous about being able to understand it fully, go ahead and use the link in the description below to download my free pronunciation guide. This will give you kind of a starting point of some of the sounds that might be a little different from your native language as you use them in English phonetics. That's it. Leave me a comment, like, all that stuff. You already know how YouTube works, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye!